Okay, so welcome everybody to Wisdom of the Pathwork lectures. And we're here going through just various of these 258 lectures that were channeled by a medium named Eva Peirakkos from 1957 to 78. And the lecture that we're working with today is an early one, number 14, and it was channeled on October 11th, 1957. So in some ways, these are have some datedness to their language and things like that, but the real depth of understanding that is conveyed in these lectures, I think, is also retained well, and so I find them not old-fashioned at all, but something I use every day. So we may have a few more people come in, but I'm going to just start going through the lecture and we'll discuss it as we go. Feel free to chime in, ask questions, make comments. So this lecture is called The Higher Self, Lower Self, and the Mask. Did people see where we're recording, or did I miss that?
Yes, we are recording.
Okay, yeah, okay, good, okay. So, the higher self, the lower self, and the mask is the name of this lecture. Greetings in the name of the Lord. Blessed is this hour in which I am permitted to speak to you, my friends. I have promised to talk to you tonight about how we in the spirit world see the entire human personality, the complete unit. You all know that you have not only a physical body, but also various subtle bodies, each representing something different. You also know that your thoughts have definite spiritual forms, and that such forms are created not only by the thoughts, but also by the feelings, since a feeling is really just an unthought thought, not yet made conscious. Although thought creates a different form than a feeling does, nevertheless, both create very definite and substantial forms. Each subtle body, as well as the physical body, has an aura, the vibration and emanation of that body. Thought forms or feeling forms reflect their image in the aura. These forms really do exist in the spirit. The auras, therefore, are not the images themselves, only reflections of the images. These forms create the spheres in the spirit world, and according to the intensity of the thoughts or feelings, they can be vague and weak or definite, strong and durable spheres. In other words, all these forms fluctuate and change since everything in spirit is in perpetual motion. The area of the physical body shows the physical sickness or health and all other conditions of the physical being. The emotional, intellectual, or spiritual reactions show in the aura of the respective subtle body. Each living being has a higher self or divine spark. This is the finest and most radiant of the subtle bodies. And it has the quickest frequency of vibration, because the higher the spiritual development, the quicker the vibration. Since the fall of the angels, the higher self surrounded itself slowly and gradually with various layers of denser matter, not quite as dense as the physical body, but infinitely denser than the higher self. And thus did the lower self come into existence. From your perspective, these layers are of subtle matter which you cannot see with your physical eye. Welcome, Laurie. So I want to pause here for a minute because I find, like still in me a little bit of, when we talk about the lower self, my own tendencies to, see that in sort of dualistic terms and good, bad, right, wrong, judgmental kinds of things. And I found it was useful um, in Brazil when they talk about the lower self. They are really actually talking about the three lower chakras, right? And so again, there can be harmonizing of the lower self, which is our survival self. It's like the root chakra is survival and physical existence, and then the second chakra is our desires and our family kind of dynamics, oftentimes the unmet and met needs, and the third chakra is our individuated sort of ego self, our mind, our thought forms, that kind of thing. And so it can be seen without moralizing, in all of this. And so I may comment on this as we go a little bit, because it's so easy for us to put on those lenses, especially, in these lectures where the guide is sort of speaking from objective truth, but when it lands in us, it comes in through our filters a little bit. So he's saying, each living being has a higher self or divine spark. And this is the finest and most radiant of the subtle bodies and the quickest frequency of vibration, because the higher the spiritual development, the quicker the vibration. Since the fall of the angels, the higher self surrounded itself slowly and gradually with various layers of denser matter, not quite as dense as the physical body, but infinitely denser than the higher self. Thus did the lower self come into existence. From your perspective, these layers are of subtle matter which you cannot see with your physical eye. The aim of spiritual development is to eliminate the lower self. Now, I think that word is maybe a word that Eva used in this. I think, there's a way that I don't think we eliminate anything. I would say we integrate, we mature. And the guide speaks of this in other places, like a lot of what is the lower self is just immature consciousness. And so we evolve, we grow the lower self, so that it's no longer blocking, the higher self, and the higher self becomes free again of the outer layers that it has acquired. In your own life, you will be able to sense quite easily with yourself or others that certain parts of the higher self are already free, while other parts are still hidden. How much is free or hidden, and how thickly it is hidden, depends on the overall development of the respective person. So, it's kind of like, also, we can have, I think, higher self and lower self admixed currents in almost everything. So I find that, it's kind of like not usually just an either or at the surface level, but it's like there's a higher self and lower self on both sides of those, in the negative, aspects, and what we might consider in the positive aspects. So, we may be able to look into that a little more, but it's useful to realize that, again, whenever we're, sort of seeing these uh, polarities, that we really want to think of them more in terms of, the yin and yang symbols, and like gradations and admixtures, and there's always the other little dot in the middle of the movement, right? And I find it's really useful to just understand whatever impulse I have, that I don't have to figure out, well, is that good or bad, in and of itself. It seems like it's not possible. But if I go in and look at it as, okay, so what is the positive aspects, what are the higher self aspects, and what are the lower self aspects of it, then I feel like I can sort myself out in a very different way that is useful. And so we're learning how to work with these aspects of our consciousness through these lectures. And so the lower self consists not only of the common faults and individual weaknesses that vary with each person, but also of ignorance and laziness. It hates to change and conquer itself. It's just got a very strong, like I want everything wonderful and I don't want anything hard kind of element to it, right? Um, it has a very strong will that may not always manifest itself outside. So it can be, kind of I guess they kind of call it, passive, or hidden manipulative kinds of things can be a way that it manifests, as well as direct confrontational will. Um, it's very proud and selfish and has a great deal of personal vanity. And it wants its way without paying the price, right? It's kind of, it wants what it wants. And it's like, when the guide says paying the price, there's a lot of lectures that kind of talk about that. And again, I think we have a tendency of interpreting that in a certain moralistic way, right? You got to pay the price. And I'm going to, keep just speaking to how our own minds trip into this kind of moralizing duality in reading these lectures and try to offer another interpretation of, what the guide is really pointing to and how to hold it, in consciousness. Because it doesn't help when we, hear these words and just create more duality. So if you can read his words, like he's talking about our faults, we're proud, we're selfish, etc. Like, um, but if you can read them as kind of neutral, like they're just, it's just kind of the way it is, it's kind of like, well, we're immature, we're 2-year-olds instead of 22-year-olds, right? It's not like we should be 22 because we're just two. And so in that 2-year-old state, we have parts of us that, only see through our own perspective and our own needs and our own wants. And so we're selfish. And, it's like the guide even has a lecture on right and wrong selfishness, where, he does talk about that, again, our, sort of moralizing duality says, oh, selfishness is bad. But he says that you have to look deeper, and that some selfishness is not bad. He also says in one place that what's truly right for the one is right for the whole. So, I think that, oftentimes we have these kind of constructs and confinements of, what we should be, according to, this elimination of our lower self, right? And I think it's really talking about facing and being conscious and, helping all of these parts of us find a different integration and maturity through our life experiences. And so if we're talking about paying the price, it's like, it's kind of like really looking at life as, yeah, it's a constant trial and error. It's a constant, exploration. Let's try this and see what happens. Well, that didn't work, and so I'm paying the price. But if I never risk, you know, uh, I'm not stupid because I risked. I risked, as part of the life force, as part of the learning curve, as part of my education. And if I discovered a consequence, or, had a price to pay in some way, I'm sure that that price also developed something in me, helped me grow, helped me, mature. And so, again, if we don't see it as punitive, if we don't see it as judgmental, all of these things take on a bit of a different perspective. So back to, we have these parts. They can be very proud, selfish, and always has a great deal of personal vanity. In the, it is the ego with all its manifestations. And so, it's like that's where we are, how we've developed. We haven't gone beyond our ego yet. But as we get more conscious, as we understand it more clearly, we can make different choices. All these characteristics are generally part of the lower self, regardless of other individual faults. There are many shades and possible forms, however, in which the lower self can display these general trends. Such manifestations depend on various other factors, such as personal faults, which can have different effects on the common traits of the lower self, the qualities of the higher self, as well as various other circumstances, also influence the outer manifestation, intensity, degree, and direction that these general trends may take. We see both the higher self and the lower self. However, not all spirits can see all the subtle bodies of a creature. Only those who can have attained a certain level of development. In other words, the mere fact that a spirit leaves its physical body behind does not indicate that it can necessarily see more than any of you. A spirit who has attained a certain level of development will not only be able to interpret the lower self, but will also be able to see through it to discover the higher self in all its splendor, because dance or physical matter does not represent an obstacle for our spiritual eyes and perception. So I like this, like because we really see beyond the temporary state of the lower self, and we can recognize the higher self, wisdom and beauty inside. So we can determine very well which thought forms come from the higher self and which from the lower self. And we can also determine which wishes and endeavors of the higher self may be mixed in with tendencies from the lower self, the original shade twisted, colored, or dirtied. And I would say that almost always we're admixed. And it's always useful, to kind of explore ourselves with, looking at, you know, especially if we have a conflict, looking at both sides and then looking at, so what's the distortion and what's the divinity on both sides instead of which one is right and which one is wrong. When messages from the higher self are tainted with lower self motives, a disorder is created in the soul that makes its bearer emotionally ill. All the various tendencies have different colors and in many cases different tones and scents. For example, a person may want something selfish, and because he or she does not want to admit that this is selfishness, begins to rationalize the selfish desire and fool himself or herself about it. We can see all this very clearly. We talk about denial, right? And indeed, this kind of self-deception is very common among human beings. And the forms of the higher self have an entirely different character than those of the lower self. So, I think like also sometimes this self-deception, is part of some of the mask, right? And ways that we, are trying to fool ourselves and protect ourselves and get our needs met, etc. But this is where it's so beautiful and powerful to, be willing, without shame or without, self-denigration, to really see, the value and the power of, who you are in your willingness to self-examine in this way and not try to hide from yourself. Um, and yet, we don't merge with everything we see there, because what the guide is saying here is who we really are is the higher self. And, these other aspects, they've been created, they've been, it's part of our spiritual journey. And so we're here to work with them. And they're really not exactly a mistake. I mean, in some ways they are, but, it's like, it's still kind of like the consequences of, completion of certain developmental phases that we're still doing. So now he's going to go on into the mask self, which is what this lecture is mostly about, because it's when, as he says, that is not really recognized sufficiently among human beings for its full significance. And, I think a lot of times Pathwork sort of overemphasizes the lower self, thinking that that's where all the transformational power and juice is. But I think if we don't really work with this mask and higher, and what they also call the idealized self-image, that we, have difficulty making that higher self connection and choice. So he says the mass self is created in the following way. When you recognize that you may get into conflict with your surroundings by giving into your lower self, you may still not be ready to pay the full price for eliminating the lower self. So this would mean, first of all, that you would have to face it as it really is with all its motives and drives. And since you can conquer only that which you are fully aware of, and so this means taking the narrow path, the spiritual path of self-awareness. Many people do not want to think that deeply. Instead, they react emotionally without thinking about facing the lower self. The subconscious feels it necessary to present a different picture of the self in order to avoid certain difficulties, unpleasantness, or disadvantages of all sorts. And thus people create another layer of the self, which has nothing to do with reality, either with that of the higher self or with the temporary reality of the lower self. It is what you might call phony or false. It is unreal. The guy has other lectures where he talks about an alienated self, and it, we misidentify ourselves with it and really get lost and confused. And I can attest to that in my own journey. So he says, I will return to the above example. The lower self dictates to the person to be quite ruthless about a selfish desire. It is not difficult for anyone of even the most limited intelligence to realize that by giving into this desire, he or she will be judged, ostracized, disliked by others, an outcome no one wants. Instead of overcoming selfishness by the slow process of development, or even, I would say sort of working with that, that's a part of us that has this need. It needs to be acknowledged, integrated, and then oftentimes, just by it being seen, it feels like its message has been delivered. I feel like I want this, I want to. And so if we don't acknowledge, if we don't validate these parts of us, we can't really overcome them. And so when he says overcoming selfishness, I would use a slightly different word as well, because we have these things in our heads about, again, sort of overpowering, like getting rid of, all of these um, kind of dualistic ways, sort of masculine approaches of transformation and change. And so instead of overcoming selfishness by the slow process of development, people often act as though they were already unselfish. But they actually are selfish. And I think this is true of most of us if we look, you know, within, and it doesn't mean that we're terribly selfish, but we all have selfishness. We all have, aspects of uh, self-reference. And so they hate the pressure of their higher selves to act contrary to the desires of their lower self nature, but feel compelled to put on an act which disturbs their inner peace since it does not agree with their still predominant lower self feelings. Their giving and their generosity are a sham, often covering up, often, um, in pretense, right? And there are varying degrees to this. We can see oftentimes very obvious examples of, feigning concern and care and giving, right? In the church circles, and I don't know. I think in the older generation that was more expected. Um, and then, we all have more subtle levels of our masks. And some of our masks are not really so nice, because in another lecture, the guy talks about, the power mask, or the mask of the will, that it really it prefers truth. So it often attacks these other masks because it sees their falseness, right? It recognizes that. But it doesn't recognize in some ways that its reaction to them, is also kind of coming from its own um, mask aspect and defense, right? A mask is essentially a defense. Let me just pause here for a second and see anybody have any observations, questions, suggestions they want to. Okay, so we shall continue. So the subconscious, I'm repeating a little bit, but back up a little here. The subconscious feels it's necessary to present a different picture of the self in order to avoid certain difficulties, unpleasantness, or disadvantages of all sorts. Thus, people create another layer of the self which has nothing to do with reality, with either that of the higher self or the temporary reality of the lower self. So I will return to the above example. Okay, well, I'm going to skip that. We've read that before. So instead of overcoming selfishness by the slow process of development, people often act as though they are already unselfish, but they actually are selfish and feel the selfishness. They hate the pressure of their higher selves to act contrary to the desires of their lower self, but feel compelled to put on an act which disturbs their inner peace. So I don't know if you can relate to this. Sometimes, our conscience feels like it's kind of like a forcing current saying you should be this way, or you should say this or do this now, and it does. It feels like pressure, and I can feel in my own self usually my inner resistance to that pressure. And I feel like how that pressure disturbs the inner peace. And since it does not agree with the still predominant lower self feelings, their giving and their generosity are just a sham. In other words, the right act is entirely unsupported by the unpurified feelings. And they may have some feelings that really do want to give, right? But it's an admixed thing. And therefore the person is at war within. So we're split and in conflict. And then the proper act becomes the act of necessity, of compulsion, instead of free choice. So with such superimposed goodness, that does not really count in the real sense. It's like that. We don't get any brownie points for that. While you may give something, you may hate the idea. Not only do people remain convinced that they need to be selfish, but are also untrue to their nature, violating their reality and living a lie. So when we feel compelled to be unselfish, we kind of attach more deeply to the need to be selfish. Yeah, I can't let go of that. And then it's also untrue to our true nature, which wants to give and wants to connect. And so we have a tremendous conflict that gets created by all of this. So I am by no means suggesting that it is advisable to give in to one's lower nature. One must fight for enlightenment and strive for development in order to purify one's feelings and desires. Who does that? That's the higher self. That's the conscious observer. That's the, adult ego consciousness that can see this and try to address it. But if this is not accomplished, there should at least be no self-deception. So even if we can't, do something, about making a different choice, it's important that we don't deceive ourselves. So I find myself a lot, just realizing, oh, I probably, the higher choice is that, but I'm not there yet. And so I'm gonna, honestly, you know, make the choice, and honestly deal with the learning curve and the consequences or whatever of that. I can't fake it. It's like it doesn't make sense. I would rather, have the stone polisher, be polishing my precious stone inside of me, in this natural way, rather than trying to hide the grit, so to speak, right? I don't know if that makes sense, but there's a way that we can, be humble and accept where we are in our imperfections, and um, not feel some kind of compulsion inside, that we should be different than we are. We have to be exactly where we are for that where we are to move into something else. And if we try to hop skip over it, we're doing ourselves a great disservice. So, we want to honor and accept all parts of ourselves. So, if we can at least be clear about, the discrepancy between feelings and actions, in this way, no mass self can form. And in some ways, we use the mask in the world, like where we're not, in deeper serious, connection or relationship. And it's always, I think, the the question. I mean, I think in some ways humanity would be better off if we were all meeting each other from the heart, genuinely every moment we interact. But I certainly don't feel that I'm there yet. So, I feel like in some way, it's just to be who I am as fully as I can, and yet have the humility to not think that, you know i'm I'm the right one always, or like I'm already arrived. Accepting my own selfishness, accepting my own negative aspects. Yeah, I don't need to hide them. Sometimes it's tricky because some of the PTSD in the lower self of the power mask, like comes out with a strong aggression, and people are like very upset by that these days. So it is a kind of survival technique sometimes also, to suppress these things and work them out inside instead of out in our world. But we shouldn't suppress them. So, however, too often people try to believe in their own unselfishness. We think we are better than we are, or we want to feel that, and then we convince ourselves in some way. And it's not that we don't have goodness inside. And so again, there's an admixture there. You don't want to throw away the baby with the bath, but you want to see where that goodness is in somewhat, a mask level. And so we don't want to fool ourselves about real feelings and motives. Uh, we we don't want to look at them, and so we hide them from ourselves as well as others. So it's fine to hide them from others, but not from ourselves so much. And sometimes it's important, to speak, to others. But if we can do the work, we can bring out the truth without the lower self, and the truth is part of the higher self. So after a while, the evil will sink into the subconscious if we keep masking it, where it will ferment and create forms that have their effect and cannot be eliminated because the person is unaware of them. The example of selfishness is merely one instance. There are many other traits and tendencies that go through the same process, my friends. When people are emotionally sick, it is always a sign that in one way or another a masked self has been created. They do not realize they are living a lie. They have built a layer of unreality that has nothing to do with their real being. Thus, they are not being true to their real personality. As I said before, being true to oneself does not mean that you should give in to your lower self, but that you should be aware of it. Do not fool yourself if you still act according to the necessity to protect yourself and not out of enlightened vision and inner conviction. But be aware that your feelings are still unpurified in this or that respect. And then you have a good basis from which to start. It will be easier for you to face yourself in this manner when you realize that underneath the layers of your lower self live your higher self, your ultimate and absolute reality, which you must eventually reach. In order to reach it, you must first face your lower self or your temporary reality instead of covering it up, because that puts an even greater distance between you and absolute reality or your higher self. To face the lower self, you must at all costs tear down the mask self. You can bring yourself to do so when you visualize the three selves as I am presenting here. So, comments or questions?
I actually have like I do try to understand why the guy doesn't like focus more why the guide makes it sound like, well, those people that do that are kind of long gone, like they can't be, because the last, like when you were reading it like 5 minutes ago, that's what I was thinking. Like a lot of people live in a mask, but like I can attest that sometimes you don't know it's a mask, but the way the guide makes it sound, it's like, oh, they're lying to themselves. And it's like, well, not on purpose. Again,
No.
that's a defense mechanism. And I feel like I would rather have a lecture that shows me but I feel like the work that we do, and it's almost like the guide's not saying, here's how to get out of it. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think mostly he's saying first we have to see it,
Right.
in order to. And I don't know, like so far, yeah, I don't know. I haven't read this whole lecture, so maybe he'll give us some more. And
Yeah,
certainly
I
in
know.
my
It
own
just feels
journey,
very like I find myself sitting here going, is that me? Am I doing that wrong? Like,
right, and this is the danger of these lectures, and so this is where I'm hoping to counterbalance some of that, because I also, I mean, it was trial by fire, because I had a very excruciating sort of perfectionism mask that, every time the guide would talk about my lower self. I mean, I was in TP for 5 years and I was terrified and didn't even understand what it meant by my lower self. So, like there and so part of my journey with these lectures has been as I've kind of gotten above the fray and healed that aspect, I see, what he's saying and maybe, when he came in 1957, right? People were much more dense than they are now about this. I mean, they totally lived completely in their masks, like that was what they understood of their real self. So sometimes I wonder maybe, some of this is like, more confrontative for those times. Eva was also a German, and so sometimes I feel maybe her sort of German culture in this thing, and there are people in the pathwork that kind of do this work, with this kind of confrontational approach, a very masculine approach. It could
right,
be that it has a right hand and a left hand path in some ways. For me, though, like you, it was deadly to try to, like hear this from this place of criticism. But when I think about, like, well, I guess I've said this before, but I always heard those lectures like that in my head and would just cringe inside when I would read that, although I found the truth and so it kept me going in. But yeah, it was hard. And then one day I heard another helper actually reading the lecture out loud, and they had this great love and compassion in their voice as they read it. And I realized, oh, that's not the same voice I'm hearing in my head. I wonder whose voice I'm hearing in my head when I read these, right?
right.
Um, so I think there's some of that. And then I think there's some of all of this other stuff that we've talked about. So I think it's important to counterbalance that and to sort of really understand there is truth in this. Um, and yet, if we come at it from our egoic consciousness, we can easily turn it back into this, weapon against ourselves. And what I keep knowing is both, both the divine, that I have where I have a direct experience of that, and the the healing that I've received from these lectures, on this whole different level, I realize, no, there's love here, right? Somehow, it doesn't convey as fully. There's power here. And I find the lectures, often, you know, if I just use the chat GPT and all of that, it doesn't seem to convey at the same level of truth to me. But totally acknowledge what you're saying. So let me know, like, as we go, and I'll try, try to keep.
Oh no, I'm just glad that when I hear it now versus 5 years ago, I mean, or I don't remember how many years, but I remember the first time I heard it, it was like every paragraph was like painful and defensive. And now it's like I'm a very technical person. I could be, I write like a technical, but now I'm like, oh, I like that the guide is being to the point, but like there are the verbiage is like you stupid idiot, like well, don't you, it's like okay, it
And
doesn't,
that may be
yeah,
where the guide's energy is, but I doubt it. I think that's where the translation comes into our own inner critic and
right, well, yeah,
attacks us.
but thank you, no,
And
I had to
but it's
say
easy
that,
to hook into this stuff.
yeah.
Exactly. They get very activated and hook into the guide's words easily. So yeah, good. See where I am. Um, so the person who wants to become happy, healthy, and at peace inwardly needs, in order to truly fulfill this present life and be in harmony with God, and thus with the inner self, to find the answers to these questions once and for all. What is the actual me? What is my higher self? What is my lower self? Where may there be a mask or a falsehood, a defense, hiding, pretense? May many people wear a mask, at least in some respects. And, you know, I, I think again, do we judge the mask? We may in our own subtle ways, like, I mean, I find I have a part of me that, especially certain masks, and we did this early work in the Pathwork where we were looking at the three masks, of love, power, and serenity. And we would do this core class where we would determine which mask was our predominant mask, and then we would go around interacting with the other masks. And it was really obvious how, certain masks were like completely hostile to certain, but it was all at this level of this projection at the mask level. And so you can see how clearly it interfered with the deeper connectiveness that we're seeking to attain in our evolution. So
I was a serenity mask.
were you a serenity mask?
I was.
And how did you feel about the power and love masks? What was your, because that's usually, it's like how we react to those other masks says a little
Yeah.
bit.
I didn't like the power mask at all, and the love mask was just a little too annoying. That's basically the way. But I will say this about the mask. I think it's exhausting to keep the mask going.
Yeah.
And I think that personally, lately, or maybe even always, I've felt like, you know what? I just want to get away from it all. I just want to get away from it all. That's like what I want to get away from maybe is like the whole keeping up the mask, Because I say things like it's too much insanity. I just want to get away from it all, you know? But actually maybe it's like, okay, I want to get away from pretending that all this insanity is not bothering me,
Uh,
you
yeah,
know?
or somewhere is like that kind of serenity, withdrawal,
Yeah.
impulse in that for sure. And so, yeah, what else might be there instead or underneath that somehow?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So let's see. Um, so many people wear a mask, at least in some respects. This mask self presents to us a very ugly color, my dear friends. It is not dark, black, or sinister, as are the trends of the lower self in different variations. The colors of the mask self are, and I don't think it's always, this case. I think he's talking more about the love mask here, sickening, are, sickeningly sweet. If you are an artist or are artistically inclined, you know how to determine a good, genuine color or an unreal, sweetly artificial coloring. You even have created a word for bad art and bad coloring. You call it kitsch. It is the same with the tones and odors of the mass self. They are sickly and nauseating. We spirits prefer the emanation and effects of the lower self, unpleasant as they may be for us, but at least they are honest. So here's a paragraph that's, seems very, very denigrating, right? To humanity and their, unconscious space of living in the mask. And, again, I think that's not necessarily, it may be how they experience it to some degree, but I don't think it conveys what I've experienced through other channels and stuff like that, even though they are aware and they see that, they see beyond that. They see into our higher self and they love us, they serve us, they totally honor and respect us. And, they only pray for or, work for our own freedom, right? And like they see our mask, I believe, more like an imprisonment around our soul. And they have compassion for that. So it is important for all of you to try to train your inner eye to see yourselves and other human beings from, the discernment point of view of, what's kind of mask and what's more real. The more you become spiritually awake, the easier it will be for you to accurately perceive yourselves and others. So again, he's not saying, become a judge and a critic of everybody. He's saying, be aware, be conscious of your own currents. And the more conscious we are of our own currents, the more we clearly see where other people are coming from in their own currents. And we still don't have to judge them. It's helpful because then we know, well, I'm not going to follow that, guy to, into some trouble or something like that, because I can see where that would go. But, so there's discernment there, but we don't have to have judgment with discernment. When you come in contact with the higher self, once your intuition has awakened through your personal spiritual development, you will feel a distinct difference between the mask and the higher self, which is where we sometimes have trouble, especially the love mask in making that decision, and sometimes the serenity mask too. I think the power mask usually recognizes that it's not the higher self. Therein lies its feeling of, somehow being secretly terrible, but, having to struggle to be okay. So you will feel the nauseating manifestations of the mass self. First of all, your own, no matter how pleasant the mass may appear to be. And I have felt, some nausea actually, and in the pathwork, when we're working with, our energies and emotional energies, it's like we can sometimes feel a kind of nausea that's even useful, to like release with gag reflex, or sometimes we even throw up. But it's kind of like, I don't know if that's quite the same thing he's referring to here. It still feels a little bit to me more like it's a kind of judgy thing. So, if your psychologist, psychoanalyst, and psychiatrist would begin to view their patients from this viewpoint, they would accomplish a lot more. And that I agree. Like if psychology, and especially back in 1957, right, had understood more of the mass self, I think that it could, would have helped people. They would have success where they are still unsuccessful. The time will come when this knowledge will be theirs, when they are mature and courageous enough to include spiritual reality in their thinking. They will discover all this and prove the truth of their success with their patients. They will solve problems with their patients, even though they cannot see what we can and what so far has appeared impossible to solve. The mere knowledge of these three parts of the human personality will make a tremendous difference in the results that they will obtain, because they will, after some practice and study, determine easily which part of the self they are dealing with at a certain phase of the treatment. They will develop a different means to deal with the different selves, and would know how to instruct the conscious and the will directing part of the person to use this information. So here is kind of alluding to, or pointing a finger towards the direction of the moon of, how do we change this, or what should we do with this? Again, when I read this, it comes to mind, through my, explorations, that this could be a description of interrelationship focusing, right? Um, but we need a tool, we need a technique. In the old days, we would do core energetics, and we would bring out, all of these suppressed feelings so that we could see what was really inside of us. And we would use the group and sometimes stress positions or intensity group energy, to kind of break through out of the rigidity of the defense or the mask. So I like, even again, this more gentle way of the inner self focusing, inner relationship focusing. So, but he's
But,
saying, go
but
ahead.
were you breaking through to your lower self?
Sometimes,
Yeah.
and
I mean,
sometimes the inner child, the hurt underneath the lower self. I mean, that's ultimately where you want to get to,
hmm,
because the lower self is, again, just a defense against the hurt. And so the guide is saying, like that if we can go beneath that personal lower self, there is evil or different kinds of, lower self. But I think in this case, especially because it's, we couldn't we couldn't feel and bear the pain at the time when it was inflicted. And so, it's like we have to kind of grow up and get other capacities and strengths in our adult self.
hmm,
And then, we're not trying to go back in and just kind of recycle all of that shit, but something else can happen where we can bring, again, our self in presence, our higher self awareness, witness state, to, to the feelings, to the pain, to the truth of the feelings, even if they are hate, or destructiveness or pride and selfishness. But um, to me, it's a little confusing sometimes. What is the difference between, pride, self-will, and fear? Is what the guide says basically is the
hmm.
qualities of the lower self. But also, those are the qualities of the mask self to me.
Well, I would say that my lower self is seriously lacking in patience, and I assume that's why I like to put on the serenity mask, you know? It's like, because if I was to show everybody how impatient I am, they would just be like, well, that guy's a jerk. You
Right,
know?
right, right. And
And
what muscles do you use, or how do you manage to suppress the impatience so that
well,
and
that's
how do you exit into your
yeah, and to go to my sanctuary, if I can find one, you know. I was lived alone for so many years, and that's why this living with Mary is a period of adjustment. It's very difficult. I
right?
mean, my deal was I'm going to my sanctuary, I'm going to chill out in my sanctuary. And I don't necessarily have that anymore.
Same kind of thing. So
Yeah.
this is where maybe, I don't know, like, to me, again, this process is like going inside to make connection with those, like the impatience, right? It's like, so that's a label.
Yeah, well, if you're saying that underneath the impatience is some kind of childhood hurt, I'm curious what
Yeah,
exactly.
I would sit with it. And this is where this inner relationship focusing, we don't have to try to figure it out with the mind. If you go and can you feel, or the next time you feel like you need your inner sanctuary and you don't have one, sit with the energy that's there of the impatience and try to simply describe it, not label it as impatience as a way of just kind of naming it and thinking something. But what kind of impatience, what's within that impatience, keep feeling it as it manifests in the body, as maybe an image might pop in, or a thought form, or a visual kind of something, that might connect you to something beyond, like that impatience is there for a reason, right?
Yeah.
And something is activating it in the situation. So you can also kind of understand more about that, I think, by hanging out with it some more.
Mm.
And really, being like, I love, like the way that they talk about self and presence is very much like the higher self in the pathwork. So it would be, they describe this as, we approach these feelings, like your impatience, as with openness, curiosity, and compassion. Who are you? Why are you feeling this? What's going on with you? I want to help. you know I'm curious. I have no clue. I don't label a bunch of things and say that's what it is. And I'm listening. I'm listening to what you, impatience, is trying to tell me right now.
Well, you were talking about your own battle with perfectionism.
Mhm.
And honestly, I do feel, that there's a battle with perfectionism going on in my wounded child. Yeah, definitely. You know?
Yeah, it could very much be connected. It's a good theory, or even a felt sense about it. Like, yeah, that there's something about that. And so, again, by staying in the energy of it, it will reveal more and more. Like of its where it came from. What its
Mm,
image is. What it believes about. Maybe oftentimes, our own impatience with ourself, also goes out to others. So it's like, kind of, we're either impatient with me or with you, and so I've found in my own journey that by what I can't stand in others, if I can, like, first learn to kind of accept and integrate inside of me, it
mm.
still is challenging sometimes. I can, once I've accepted it in me, I want to really blame them.
I've heard you talk about I've heard you talk about waiting, not like waiting in line, Darlene. You don't like waiting in line. It's
Exactly.
sort of like a trigger for you, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And that's very, it's almost, I can feel that almost in a um animalistic sense. I think it has something to do with my ADHD nervous system wiring. Um,
I don't like waiting in line either, Darlene.
yeah, yeah. And so you maybe say,
Or
so
being
what
stuck in
can we,
traffic or
like,
anything
so
like
if we can bring the
that.
self and presence there, see, this is where, we're not trying to change that fact. That's our truth. We don't like waiting in line. But when we're in that situation where we're feeling that impatience, and we can bring the self and presence there, and just acknowledge, yes, I see how hard it is for you to wait in line. I see how that is creating, this intensity inside of you, and I acknowledge you. I don't know exactly where it's coming from, so I'm willing to sit and understand more if there's more to be,
Yeah,
understood.
yeah.
But by validating in ourself, instead of judging it, oh, I shouldn't be impatient, what's wrong with me, I should get
Right,
out of this impatience, or control
right.
this impatience. But it's, yeah, we should control the impatience. We don't want to bring it out, but we shouldn't judge it, and we shouldn't try to suppress it. We should, try to not act it out, and then go inside and meet it as
Yeah.
fully as possible.
I tend to say things like, someday I'll be fine with waiting in line. When it's not, I know deep down inside that's never gonna happen.
I have actually found that my patience overall, and my reactivity overall, it could come, sometimes, it's like it slips up, and I, go back to square one. But mostly I feel a general improvement
Yeah.
as we go. And mostly I feel a little more calm, and a little more grounded, and a little more okay. And then there are certain things that just spin the heck out of me, like all of these protests right now going on and stuff like that.
Mm,
But yeah, it's like we're here really to just try to you know be with all of this stuff, as in this place of of self-acceptance. And so, to discern, and I find the guide is beautiful around discerning spiritual truth and law. And so that discernment is important because, I don't want to judge myself in comparison with that discernment, but I want to use that discernment to help me wake up out of my pain body or my suffering. And when I can see, oh, I see how I'm lost in this state, a little bit, and I can see how maybe, that helps me like pull back or, feel less, frantic about it or something. And when I can see that, yeah, I have this huge self-will or this huge fear in me, like, so fear is part of the lower self. We tend to justify it a little more than we do the other two. We think fear is more real in a way, but the guy is saying, fear does not help. Even if it might be real, unless maybe you do need that adrenaline surge if a tiger is chasing you right now in the jungle. But otherwise, it's part of, who we are, but in our consciousness now, rather than being just around physical danger to protect ourselves, like we are afraid of all kinds of things. And, I
Fear
think they
would
say,
be
go ahead.
fear that we might be swallowed up by general uh, stupidity.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, and
for lack
all
of a better
it's like
word.
all the timelines are here right now. We could be afraid of Nazis. We could be afraid of asteroid contact. We could be afraid of, like any disaster, you name it. It's like looming on the horizon, according to
Hmm.
somebody. And so like there's this heightened sort of anxiety in the world, but it's because we're not grounded in spirit.
Right.
And
Not,
so, hopefully it will lead to, some of that. And but in the meantime, yeah, it's intense. And I
yeah.
keep remembering, like in my own, journey, how many times I've, had knuckle, white knuckle moments, and yet, and sometimes, clearly what seemed like disaster in the moment would transpire. But if I look back, I made it through. It all worked out, right? And things that I didn't really understand were in play. And so, more and more I'm seeing in my own experience, how there is maybe a quantum reality that is affected. And so if I stay, identified with the fear and locked in the fear, I may actually manifest that which I fear. And then, if I'm really looking at, my fears, and looking at, yes, I don't want to mask, I don't want to pretend I'm cool with it all, but I don't want to like totally identify, yes, the world is falling apart, yes, it's going to be catastrophe, because that way isn't ultimate truth either. And the guide would maybe call that catastrophizing or something, right?
So it's like any any ways of any identification or any ways of doing certain things um kind of trigger the attachment, kind of like you're attached to any methods or any identification triggers attachment um also um and it's kind of yeah, I don't know, like I guess what I'm trying to say is um if we're trying to identify with certain ways of certain things of doing things, or identify with certain masks, it sort of also triggers attachment and get used to it. And from what you were saying, that what was Guide saying, um, that yeah, it's a defense mechanism that you are covering up for the fears, or kind of um pushing them away, making it look like they're not there.
Is there, you have an example maybe
um,
you're thinking of, or?
no. For me, I don't know. I kind of I feel like I've always been in battle with it. Like in battle with identifying with certain ways of doing things, like um, I don't know, can't really, yeah, like in a spiritual world, the same thing is like, especially when you start doing something, you start like explaining everything the same way. Kind of, this is the explanation for this is the explanation for that, um, and then some this I tend to sabotage, like something sabotages it inside of me every single time, for good or for bad. I guess it's a good thing, but also living in sabotage or living with constant battle is also exhausting.
Yeah, I mean, it
Like Frank
sounds to
was
me
saying,
like
it's
it's like
exhausting
there's
to
an
have a
outer,
mask.
go
Yeah,
ahead.
sorry. Like Frank was saying, it is exhausting to have a mask. And and for me, like, yeah, I've experienced glimpses of having a mask, but then I almost constantly, almost immediately, like, start sabotaging. Oh, now I'm this, or now I'm that, or now this is my way of doing things. And so there's something always sabotages it inside of me.
It
And
sounds like whatever you're seeing, you're kind of critical of, or you're judging,
yeah,
right?
constantly,
So,
yeah.
right, and so that is the mask,
Okay.
right? Is the critic, is the judge, is the one that, has the how you should be, that's not all of these things that you see. Perspective, right? And
Yeah.
and so that's an aspect of the mask the guide calls the idealized self-image. It's an
Mm.
image of how we think we want to be, and when we fall short of that, we're unhappy with ourselves. And so if we get attached to the image of how we should be, yeah, it creates a lot of conflict, a lot of suffering and pain, because we are always going to fall short. We will never achieve that bar.
So even if I like that ways of trying to identify with something, or I don't know, putting, like, to me, I thought it's almost wearing a mask, and I'm trying not to wear the mask, so I sabotage myself. But even sabotaging, you're saying, is a form of mask because I'm like
Well, that
attached.
could be another part of you, right? So we're many, many parts,
Yeah.
right? And so you would have to understand who it is that is a saboteur and why they're doing that, right? And it may be lower self, or it may come from an image that's, not ultimate truth, but, it's how it was when you were young. And so you think that that's what you have to do somehow. you know what do you know about your self-sabotage? I think what I'm hearing, let me just say this, is whenever we try to do something with our outer will, I should make myself be, eat better, do run more, do this, like the discipline thing. I mean, some people manage to do that, but most people that I know anyway, including myself, discipline is not the answer. That's like, again, this superimposed, conscience telling us what we should do, and that automatically creates the natural resistance to that inside of us. Our real self says, fuck you, I'm not listening to what the devil is telling me. That's not God. That voice that is trying to make me, force me into being somehow this way, that's not God. That's basically the egoic consciousness that wants to control you so you can control your fate, and so it's all about uh like maintaining that forcing current about how you should be.
Yeah, I think
It's okay if you're
that,
sabotaging that. You should.
yeah, there's certain things that is great that I'm sabotaging, and but the other other things could come definitely from negative place of my comes to mind is like my mom's critical way to everything. So it's like
That's right. It's
getting
how an
some
ego
from
trains
her.
another ego to
Yeah,
respond to the mask,
yeah,
right? To be the way. It's all about control. It's not about growth. It's not about development. It's not about choice.
yeah.
The absolute opposite of anything spiritual. And that's kind of what the guide is saying in this. That's why it's saying this
Mhm.
stuff is awful, because it is on one level.
Yeah, so just trying to kind of slow down and understand it. No, not even like mentally understand it, but like spend time with it. Sit
I
down.
think it will help you to, learn more about these parts and learn which parts are up and learn to identify more clearly, what's going on and how they're interacting. And so I don't know if you still have time on Sunday evenings. We're still doing our little focusing group, or if you want to
Yeah, I'm
do
planning
some
to
sessions or
join
something, it
again.
might be good.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, but this is, this is important because we often confuse this mask idealized self-image with our higher self. And we think that it is the voice of goodness and authority of God, right? Yes,
Mhm.
I should be unselfish. Yes, I should be loving. But unfortunately, that thought form can't make our hearts open. In fact, most of the time that thought form makes our heart close immediately.
Mm.
Yeah. That's a good one. Yeah, definitely.
So if we want our hearts open, which we do, I mean, that's a good desire to have, but we can't approach it the way we're approaching it. It's backfiring. Okay, well, shall we see if we can go back and got a little more of this lecture, I think, to go. Okay, let's see. So he's talking about, if therapy or, this understanding were more widespread, then we could develop different means to deal with the different selves and would know how to instruct the conscious and will directing part of the person to use this information. It will make a great deal of difference. If a person is ready to accept help in this respect, the conscious will directing part of the self is on the proper road. What then remains to be accomplished is to penetrate the subconscious layers of the personality with these truths as well. So we have to bring these truths into these parts of us that don't know about them. And we can't do that by, trying to drill them into them. We have to say, I have a beautiful present here for you. You'll love this. Come here and let me help you with it, right? So, if a person is ready to accept the help, what remains to be accomplished is to penetrate the subconscious layers. And so that all the inner resistance will be overcome. See, the resistance is there for a reason as far as it's concerned, and so we have to kind of negotiate with it and help it realize that no, that was something that happened in the past and that it's safe really to do something different now. And so, all of this is what is the inner work that is done by the person himself with, help of others, of course. If you want to walk this path and be cured of your emotional sicknesses, it is important for you to understand all this. Even if you are not what is called a neurotic, there are only minor deviations from the law within you. It will be very useful for you to understand all this and to meditate on it. It may explain why it frequently happens that a person undergoing psychoanalysis with a doctor who rigidly follows a school of thought that does not admit to any spiritual truth and who is not very intuitive about such things may plunge into a crisis in which his state of mind becomes worse than before treatment. Of course, there may also be doctors possessing good intuition and a strong sense of guidance, in which case the undesirable outcome may not happen quite so often or so strongly. But when the mask has been torn down and the patient is confronted with the lower self, the experience may be so shattering that the patient will break down completely, leave therapy, and suffer even more serious consequences. So again, if we don't have the proper container for this work, including, what we've been discussing even around the container that Eva offers with these lectures, I think it's tricky. And yet, there's wisdom here, and there is, a way that we can create this right container. And on the other hand, if this person were told what I'm telling you and thus prepared for what to expect, so much hardship and often even tragedy could be avoided. If a patient knew that he or she has to face the lower self, which exists in every human being, and also knew that this lower self, unpleasant as it may be, is not the ultimate I or truer self, and that the higher self, which is perfection, waiting to grow out of these layers of imperfection, is the true self, then this shock would not occur. Therefore, this knowledge is important for your psychologists and doctors of all kinds, as well as for all teachers and parents. It will help a great deal. And then he has a Q&A here. So sometimes these go off in lots of different directions. Let's see. So yeah, they want to know a metaphysical explanation of allergies, especially to things they love. Are you interested in the answer? Let me see what other questions there are. We can go back if we need to. There's a lot of hypocrisy in this world, which is, of course, the mass self. It is encouraged by the world because the world wants to see good. From the viewpoint of the whole world, is it not preferable to do and act right, even if it is a mask, than to remain in one's lower self when one cannot eradicate it? Answer. Everybody can eradicate it if they really want to do so. It is only a question of how much can be eradicated in the present incarnation. So he's saying, we can do it, but it may take more than one incarnation. However, enough can be eradicated so that you will not commit crimes or do harmful things to others. Besides, one does not have to choose between giving in to the lower self and creating a mask self. As I have explained it, even if the feelings cannot be purified at once, because this takes quite a long time and a combination of effort and patience, you can become aware of your own imperfections, unclean desires, and lower nature. At the same time, you can still act in accordance with the standards of your society, as opposed to believing that the mass self is your true nature and real self, thus fooling yourself and creating an inner lie. In other words, you do not have to choose between becoming a cannibal, if this is your lower self, and becoming hypocritical and fooling yourself. Even if you cannot or will not do what is needed to transform yourself, you should be aware of your lower self and know that you act according to necessity and your own convenience, while your feelings are still unpurified and not always in accordance with your outer actions. Although you are taking the path of purification, you will not have any measure of success until you are willing to wait and work and work and wait. In the meantime, self-honesty is absolutely essential as a necessary requisite for any success in this most wonderful venture. But even if you are unwilling to take this road, it is infinitely better to have no self-illusions than to create this unhealthy and sickly aura. So how is it possible to undo what your lower self has manifested in the way of physical illness? In the first place, my dear friends, you should not try to eliminate the consequences first. That would be too easy. If your lower self has created an illness, that illness has to be accepted first. You should go about finding the roots or the part of your lower self that has created this illness. The lower self has to be met and completely explored. Your aim must be purification and perfection for its own sake. You do it for the love of God that you have in you and not in order to avoid putting up with a discomfort, which is, mostly why we try to, most people that come from the Pathwork are trying to get out of pain, right? But this is where that transition kind of happens, where we recognize pain sometimes is something that we have to be patient with and sit in and learn from. And yet it's very difficult. And so we can have great compassion and great acceptance and understanding for all of the feelings that accompany that circumstance. True, it takes a lot of overcoming and inner strength to sufficiently purify the motives first, but that is the necessary foundation. While doing this, you are at the same time learning a lot of other things. Thus, spiritual strength grows as you learn to apply absolute self-honesty. Once your motives are pure, the sickness will not matter half as much as the state of your soul. To the degree that the ego and the comfort of all that goes with it loses importance, you have followed a very important spiritual law. Thus, health will be gradually restored. This law has to do with the giving up of the ego self, which Jesus taught. Only thus will you win your life. So begin by meeting your lower self with courage, optimism, humility, and in a spirit of loving warfare. We use, like it's like the battle is the battle with and for love, right? In another tradition that I work with. So we like the images of battles and warfare, but we don't use it in terms of negative aggression or hatred or hostility, but it's a battle of love. And so once you discover your lower self and shed all the masks and all the covering layers, you'll begin to work on the different aspects of the lower self. You do this by daily observation and self-testing, observing again and again how far your inner currents still deviate from what you wish them to be. As you do so and become master over your lower self, you learn real self-honesty, and your motives for development become purer and purer. Your vision will widen, enlightenment will be given to you, and your illnesses will gradually disappear. So you should not even think of your illness first, but of the root of the problem. That will be the only lasting success. The only one, my dear. If your wish is to recognize in the spirit world, if you truly want to purify yourself, not merely rid yourself of an unpleasant consequence that are most visible or noticeable to you, help and guidance will come to you so that you can do battle with your lower self, since no one can do it alone. Question. I asked last time why Hindu philosophy does not have the fall of the angels, and you promised that you would answer it tonight. I think most of us have read these lectures, so I guess we can see what he has to say here. The first reason is that Eastern philosophy rightly puts spiritual progress above all. Everything else that has ever happened in creation is only of secondary importance. And this is very true, my friends. However, it is useful in some cases that light be shed on certain facts that occur in the distant past, because the reason of existence on earth, the reason for good and evil, and answers to other questions are necessary for some people to know. The understanding of certain facts, even if they can only convey a very general and broad picture, will eliminate doubts that may stand in the way when deciding on the path of perfection and purification. For the most part, the souls incarnated in the East do not feel as strong an urge to probe and search in this respect as does the Western mind. Therefore, they say, we do not need to know anything else. The important thing is how we develop. The second reason is a little bit more complicated to convey to you. I once gave a lecture about the two main aspects of God, the active or male aspect and the passive or female aspect. I explained that in the active aspect, God is personality, active, thinking, planning, the creator. In the female aspect, God is in a state of being. From the explanation in that lecture, it will easily be for you to recognize that Eastern teachers and philosophers have experienced God in the female and passive manifestation. That is a partial answer to this question. The fall of the angel shows the events in creation where God manifested as creator and therefore in his male aspect. In this tragedy, God was enacting and creating new conditions whereby the return to him would be assured eventually to all creatures. It is therefore understandable that a philosophy experiencing God in the female aspect would be less likely to receive enlightenment regarding God's male aspect, while Western philosophy, open to the experience of God's personality aspect that is active, would be blind to the experience of the female side of God and enlightenment in the Eastern sense. And I want to just say here, I think that in some ways, what we're doing by, again, this interrelationship focusing, which is a very sort of receptive form of meeting ourselves and working with all of our parts, is that, it's a psychological rather than a spiritual approach to some degree. But it is spiritual in the sense that who that inner higher self is, right, is just our being nature, is our, feminine aspect of God within us. And by activating that, and to bring it into presence, and, that unconditional love nature for an acceptance of whatever is occurring from this active outer masculine God, that's bringing riots and chaos and all kinds of shit, So we can find the peace that passes understanding by going into that feminine aspect of God, is my sense. So the third reason refers to the fall of angels as having a great deal to do with the spirit of Jesus Christ. He plays a major part in the fall of the angels. Eastern religion, having received a number of emissaries of its own, often very great, very exalted, very highly developed spirits, is reluctant to recognize that others in many respects not as spiritually advanced as themselves may have received an even greater one. In fact, the greatest of all created beings. And there are many Eastern people that I know of that also see Jesus as a yogi. They don't see him as, the ultimate, one and only Son of God. But I think that's also not what the guide sees either. So I think, again, this is more back in the 50s that you could maybe make this statement. These three reasons together give the main explanation, or at least answer your question best. I do not doubt that other explanations may be found too. So he's following up, not understanding that one of the reasons has to do with Jesus Christ, but why don't they have something similar to it? Answer: this is because, as I said, the other reasons count too, because they do not consider it very important to know about these things, because they have experienced God differently and not in his active aspect. Meaning in the East, there's a kind of, cyclic nature, it's the yin and the yang, and so there isn't the evolutionary aspect so much. There is the soul development, but not, like the outer reality is kind of cyclical. So he says, is that perhaps the reason why the female aspect of God is recognized more there and the male aspect of God more in the West? Certainly, it also explains that in the East, spiritual development is much further advanced, and it is usually the women who are spiritually more awake or easier to guide. In the West, technique and material progress are further advanced because this, in turn, is typically a male aspect. It is again the creating, the doing that are manifested. And, all of us have both aspects, right? And we love the creating and the doing. It's kind of like trying to bring them into balance. So, and the two should unite because they complement each other, and it would create a wonderful wholeness if they would exchange the knowledge each has in advance of the other. And if we could integrate that balance and truth within us. So does that mean in general that Eastern teachings have lived through a different phase of Brahman and want to go into finding the Brahman where all these things are one? Answer: yes, and it should be. Again, in this respect, as far as spiritual and religious teachings are concerned, the Western and the Eastern side should unite because both sides will furnish the complete picture only when put together. And it's interesting, since 1957, how much has that happened? How much, like in the 60s, the gurus, like they started coming over. We have, like this whole, vast, and some of it is just commercial and kind of Eastern light stuff that we do in our Western thing, like, yoga exercises and things like that. But still, they're good, and it has infused, and we are, trying, I think, to bring that together and blend it. So question is the fall of the angels within Maya, and the answer is, oh no, Maya is the result of it, my friend. So then the question, how do spirits learn language? I don't know if that's, I guess it's just 9. You want me to read all the questions? We'll just go exploring, I guess, and see what they bring up. says, I will answer both questions. The spirits in the spirit world do not use human languages among each other, of course. They do not need that, for we have the spiritual language. As I have explained, each thought creates automatically a form and becomes apparent. So that is our language. We spirits only learn languages for very definite and good purposes. In other words, if we have a task to fulfill with human beings, we need the knowledge of your human languages, not only in connection with mediumship. When a spirit has a task to guide a human being who is no medium at all, it still has to know the language its protege knows, although we see the thought of the respective being too. Now, now it may be the case, of course, that a spirit is chosen as a guardian who, remembering his last language on earth, does not have to learn the language anew and will be assigned to a person who speaks the same language. But there are also special instances where the learning of a language becomes necessary, and for that we have schools, just as you have schools. We have schools for many, many subjects, and language is one of them. But we learn them easier because here again, matter does not stand in our way, and that even applies to languages. How that applies is impossible for you to imagine. I have no words to describe it. You just have to use your intuition, your feelings, and perhaps you will sense what I mean by this. So it is easier for us to learn languages than it is for human beings. As far as your second question is concerned, whether a spirit can speak through a medium in a language the medium does not know, the answer is yes, and it has happened many times. But there is a very definite and distinct type of mediumship necessary for that. There are many different types of mediumship, even of trance mediumship alone, not to speak of all the others. There may be direct voice mediumship when you can hear the actual voice of the spirit in a different part of the room. There may be materializations, levitation, and many more phenomena that I cannot even enumerate here. One such phenomenon is, and the Bible refers to it too, using the word tongues for languages. The language is spoken through a medium that he or she does not know. But for all these different types of mediumship, a special training of the medium, as well as for the spirits in connection with the medium, is necessary. It is a different form of materialization or transfiguration. There are, for instance, mediums whose actual faces take on an entirely different shape, even a different bone structure. This is what we call transfiguration. The speaking of foreign tongues is an auditory transfiguration. But as I said, different conditions have to be fulfilled with each of these types of mediumship. The spirit world of God is a world of order. When it is recognized here that a human being can fulfill a task as a medium, it will first be determined for what type of mediumship this person's particular talent is best. What may be the most important task for the living conditions and surroundings of that particular person, and according to all these considerations. And the most important consideration from our viewpoint is always what is best for spiritual development, what serves the great plan most efficiently, and not what may be sensational and phenomenal forces are set in motion to train this particular medium for his or her task. Once this task has been chosen and worked for, it is unlikely that there will be any changes in the type of mediumship unless there is a real good and spiritual reason for it. Thus works the world of God, which, as I said, is above all a world of order. So I want to just comment on that. I think, we often don't realize that there are all of these different kinds of mediumship and that we are all mediums in some form. I mean, I think that's kind of pretty much across the board. We may not, do the speaking in tongues, or we may not do the channeling that Eva did, but we have our own unique forms of mediumship, even intuition. Some of us that have a lot of emotional stuff, we're actually transport mediums, and we're sensitive and we're receptive, and we pick up feeling and we transform it through our system, through our being, and that serves the plan as well. And then there's many other forms people do, communicate with their guides, with like just again your journey on this path, and what your life service is in various ways, I think comes through in mediumistic ways. And when we're doing these works for God comes through us to do them in various ways. So I think there's a deeper study that we're just kind of on the edges of in how to do all of that as we go more into 5D and we can become, more available to that world. I think there will be more and more of these kinds of manifestations. So, question. I wanted to know what the spiritual world thinks about this new planet Sputnik. That dates us for sure. That, my dear, depends entirely on the spiritual, moral, ethical attitude of all concerned. The thing itself is of no more importance as far as we are concerned. Nothing in itself is, from our point of view, of any importance. The only importance is what you human beings make of it. And with that, my friends, I leave you with the blessings of the Lord. Go your way in peace. Know that God is present within you, and try to find him. Do not let the clouds of the powers of darkness destroy your sight and your sense of truth that every so often touches your heart. Be in God.
The spirit
Okay.
world of God is a world of order. I believe that sentence is going to stick with me for quite some time.
Yeah, especially, given our such chaos and disorder in our current, physical world, it's like and he says that in many ways. And also, even in the categories of darkness, they are very organized and ordered as well, in
Mhm.
the spirit world. So it's more it seems to be more hierarchical and more uh in a construct. And then again, here on 3D, free will applies. There's, and on the planet, it's like it's created for a different experience and experiment, and a different way of, you know learning and understanding. So I would say, it definitely doesn't appear to be very ordered. But
My personal life is a battle for order,
uh-huh.
day in and day out,
Yes. I
you
think
know?
I think that's, and again, depending, on the capacity of our executive function and our, you know, whole system, right? How good we are, and again, that goes back to childhood wounding and childhood issues,
Yeah.
about I had a mother who was, very ordered and disciplined. But because I was ADHD, that was like a bad combination for both of us, right? And nobody
Mm.
knew what the deal was, right? She didn't understand why I couldn't, be ordered. But
Right.
it's literally not possible. And maybe in some way it's all defense and it's all smoke and mirrors. I'm still open to that possibility. If I could get a healing, maybe that would be cool. But I think there is something almost genetic in it, and almost, neurological, that, so I've learned to accept, to a certain extent, disorder. That doesn't mean that I don't find order and that I don't create order, but it has to be in my own way and not the way I see everybody else doing it out there. And
Mm.
I have to, my order mostly comes through trusting in the flow of things and being present moment to moment with my list of to-dos, with, like, hopefully, times on the calendar when I have something scheduled. But there's a kind of order that comes out of, okay, where does my flow next? And everything eventually, as long as I make sure that I've got it on the list, is gonna get accomplished.
Mm.
And most of it today, I also notice, how much everything, I have my order, and then, the computer breaks down, or my bank sends me a message that something screwed up there. Or, there's a million distractions and a million things that take the order and just throw it out the window, right? So I used to get very upset about that. I used to go into, spasms of paroxysm around it. And that did not work anymore. It only made things get crazier. It's like the more crazy I got inside about how crazy everything was, the more crazy everything escalated. And I began to see, oh, I think there is a mirroring effect here in creation that way. And so I started, like, working again, not with willpower to control, my reactions, but with consciousness, to pay attention and to, you know, meet all of those reactions in a different way. And that has done more than I know, to kind of slowly, gradually, and it's not done yet, but I feel like there's good progress. And I feel like, yeah, I'm kind of attached now, part of me doesn't want to give up my way of flow for some kind of orderly discipline. But I don't know if I'm needed to or not. So I'm open. If God wants that, if that's part of what will make me whole, then I say yes. Show me. And be patient with me as I rebel and kick and scream. Okay, well, this is, I think, a useful lecture, good, good exploration with everybody. So
Thank
thanks
you.
for coming.
Yeah.
It's
thank
good to
you.
see everybody.
You
Yeah.
too. Very good.
Thank you. Yeah.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.